There's been a dramatic twist in a historic Sydney cold case with the man accused of throwing Scott Johnson off a cliff more than 30 years ago, convicted of his murder.
These are the 5 instances where cold cases were solved when no one expected it. Welcome to Mysterious Hook, where we shed light on mysterious cases across the country. My name is Matt, and today we are looking at 5 cold cases solved in 2022. But first, if you haven't subscribed to our channel by now, please consider hitting that subscribe button and liking. Let's give a deep dive into these solved cold cases without any further ado. Susan Arlene Winters was born on March 14, 1966 in Oklahoma. Throughout the years, Susan proved to be gifted in both academics and athletics. After obtaining a graduate degree in political science from Oklahoma University, she went on to study law. Her career flourished from the start. She worked for a year in the Clark County District Attorney's Office, toiled at a Las Vegas law firm, and sometimes filled in as a judge in North Las Vegas Justice Court. While Susan succeeded in her career, she also wanted to start a family. She married Brent Dennis, a psychologist, in August 1995. Their first daughter, Avis L., was born 4 years later in October 1999. The family welcomed a second daughter, Anna Danielle, in April 2002. Susan was passionate about every aspect of life. She was an avid reader, a marathon runner, an animal lover, and a devoted mother and wife. Despite being a hard-working attorney, she dedicated all of her free time to her family. This would all change on January 3, 2015. At 6:48 a.m., that day Dennis called 911 after finding his 48-year-old wife, Susan Winters, unresponsive in bed. Paramedics quickly arrived to find Susan barely holding on to life. She was taken to the hospital, and unfortunately at 2:26 p.m., Susan passed away after Dennis instructed doctors to take his wife off of life support. According to the coroner's report, Susan died of a combination of ethylene glycol poisoning and oxycodone intoxication. Ethylene glycol is the main ingredient in antifreeze. Her death was ruled a suicide. However, the strangest thing in this case was that no evidence in the bedroom showed Susan harmed herself. Detectives found no suicide note, no glass with antifreeze remnants of liquid in it, and no prescription bottles or antifreeze containers. An impossible scenario if the notion of suicide was to be believed. When asked why his wife committed suicide, Dennis told police that he and Susan had been fighting for quite some time. Susan was drinking while on antidepressant medication for depression and had threatened to kill herself on many occasions. He claimed he found 2 bottles of antifreeze in the garage and assumed that Susan drank the antifreeze at some point. Dennis also said he slept the entire night and woke up to find Susan unresponsive. Although Susan's death was already deemed suicide and the case was closed, the Winters family was not ready to accept that she chose to take her own life. In 2016, Susan's parents, Danny and Avis Winters, hired retired FBI detective and attorney Tony Sergo, who filed a civil lawsuit against Brent Dennis on their behalf. The suit alleges that Susan died under suspicious circumstances and blames her demise on Dennis, who had a financial motive. Indeed, Dennis was very keen on the financial benefit that followed his wife's untimely death. He stood to benefit from a $1 million life insurance policy taken out on Susan's life. He was also the beneficiary of Susan's inheritance worth $1 million. Within 2 days of his wife's death, he was in talks with the insurance company. Apart from monetary benefits, Brent Dennis held a much darker secret. The more Sergo dug deeper, the more Dennis looked like a suspect. Sergo found many clues that have never been looked at before, clues that paint another picture of this respected Nevada psychologist. In his investigative report, Sergo cited potential evidence against Dennis, including an alleged substance abuse addiction and a connection to a man named Jeffrey Crosby, who had been convicted of felony possession with intent to sell cocaine. During his civil deposition, Dennis admitted to buying drugs from Crosby. When this secret came out, Susan, of course, was very upset. Susan demanded that Dennis seek treatment for his drug abuse. It was revealed that Susan had previously threatened to report his alleged drug use to authorities. Cell phone records obtained by the family lawyers show that she called and sent text messages to Crosby several times in the days before her death to stop him from selling drugs to Dennis. And arrestingly enough, she confided in some friends that their marriage was falling apart the day before she died. Susan's parents, Avis and Danny, insisted Susan did not kill herself. According to her parents, she was a bit upset, but in no way did that lead to her committing suicide. In fact, Susan purchased airline tickets to San Jose, California, Atlanta, and Hawaii to attend her daughter Anna's cheerleading competitions. Susan's parents said she was really excited that Anna would be attending college soon. Dennis had previously claimed that Susan had searched about antifreeze several times before her death, which made him believe that she took her own life by consuming antifreeze. But months later, investigators discovered that the last of the searches on antifreeze poisoning was done at 5:15 a.m., when Susan was already unconscious and nearly dead. Dennis also traveled to Orleans Hotel to meet with Crosby on 4 occasions after her death, between January 9, 2015 and March 27, 2015. After consistent insistence from the Winters family and armed with newfound evidence, detectives decided to revisit the case. On February 2017, during a traffic stop near his home, Dennis was arrested on suspicion of open murder with a deadly weapon. Allegedly, he received prescription painkillers from his own patients. And arrestingly, even at the time of his arrest, he had 3 painkiller pills in his right pocket. He was formally charged with voluntary manslaughter after being taken into custody. In April of 2017, Susan's manner of death was changed from suicide to undetermined following Dennis's arrest. While Dennis remained free on a $250,000 bail, he entered an Alford plea in which he does not admit guilt, but concedes that prosecutors have sufficient evidence to prove his guilt. 4 years after Susan's tragic demise, Dennis was finally sentenced to serve 3 to 10 years in prison for voluntary manslaughter in connection with the 2015 death of his wife. While the Winters family is relieved by the outcome, Susan's daughters, who are now 22 and 20 years old, stood by their father. In a statement in court, they wrote that their father only entered the Alford plea in the case to avoid the harsher punishment, but did not have anything to do with their mother's death. October 8th was one of the coldest days in Klamath County, Oregon. Around 5:30 p.m. on that day, the Klamath County Sheriff's Office got a shocking call. A man was cutting firewood in a wooded area near the lake on Dead Indian Highway in Klamath County, where he discovered 2 lifeless bodies. When detectives arrived at the scene, they found the dead bodies of 2 teenagers, 1 male and 1 female, hidden beneath branches and shrubs. Both of the victims had multiple gunshot wounds to the head. The victims were identified as 19-year-old Kirk Wiseman and 17-year-old Cynthia Frayer. People were shocked at the fact that a double homicide, which appeared to be an abduction and murder by a stranger, could occur in Klamath County. It was concluded that they both had been shot multiple times in the head with a .22 caliber pistol. A letter was also found in which Cynthia wrote to her mother about her hopes and dreams, as well as all the activities they did prior to her death, but she never got the chance to send it to her mother. An autopsy indicated that Cynthia had been sexually assaulted. Retracing their steps before the murder, police found that Kirk and Cynthia had no connection to the area. They had been hitchhiking in Washington State and Oregon and had plans to go to Crater Lake, a spot where Frayer always wanted to visit, when they vanished without a trace in September 1978. As the investigation went on, detectives also discovered that before going missing, the pair had stayed the night at a motel in Roseburg. They were then picked up by a person who claimed to have dropped them off at Grants Pass Restaurant. But unfortunately, despite extensive investigation of that person, nothing ever came of it. No other suspects ever came to light regarding this double homicide. Over the years, several people were questioned, but no one was ever officially charged. The case soon turned cold and stayed that way for nearly 40 years. In 2018, portions of Cynthia's clothing were sent to the Oregon State Police Crime Lab in Bend, where forensic scientists recovered the DNA of an unknown male. The unknown male DNA was then entered into the CODES database but didn't hit on a suspect. Investigators then decided to try their luck with a new genetic genealogy technology and sent the DNA sample to the Virginia-based forensic service Parabon Nanolabs. The unknown male DNA was entered into a genealogy website. Soon, in the summer of 2021, a potential match was discovered. The suspect was identified as Ray Whitson Jr. Investigators discovered that Whitson had previously lived with his family in Klamath Falls between 1976 and 1982, and had worked at a lumber mill. He was familiar with the area where the two bodies were found. Whitson had a prior criminal record, but his DNA had never been uploaded to the CODES database. It was time to apprehend the culprit after all of these years, but unfortunately, it turned out that the suspect had died in 1996. Upon contacting his family, his children agreed to provide a DNA sample, and it was later confirmed that the DNA found at the crime scene indeed belonged to their father, Ray Whitson Jr. Although the case was immediately suspended, knowing that the suspect had long passed, detectives still felt it was crucial for him to bring answers to both Frayer and Wiseman's families, and finally give evidence to the victims' families, including the handwritten letters. Scott Russell Johnson was born in Los Angeles on November 27, 1961, to his parents Grant and Barbara Johnson. Being the family's third child, he was always pampered by his older sister Terry and his older brother Steve. In 1970, after moving to Colorado, their parents separated and the siblings stayed with their mother. Thereafter, the father stayed out of most of their lives, but through these hardships, Scott and his siblings made the best out of the situation by banding together. Scott was a bright student and excelled in mathematics, even taking college-level courses while he was just a freshman in high school. Scott was then accepted into the California Institute of Technology. In 1983, he went to Cambridge University in England for a year. In January of 1984, Scott met Michael Noon, an Australian student studying for a PhD at Cambridge University, and they started a relationship. But by that summer, Scott had to return to the United States. Cheerfully, he shared about his relationship with Noon with his brother after coming back home. By 1985, he earned a full scholarship to undertake a PhD in mathematics at the Australian National University, so he moved to Australia. It was a perfect opportunity for this gifted young mathematician to finally reunite with his partner after months of being in a long-distance relationship. Scott applied for permanent residency in 1987 based on his relationship with Noon. The following year, Scott received advice from the Department of Immigration that he would be eligible for permanent residency if a genuine and continuing relationship between Scott and Noon persisted up to March 10, 1989. However, it did not work out, and Scott and Noon separated while continuing to be friends. On the morning of Saturday, December 10, 1988, a man set out spearfishing with his 13-year-old son at Bluefish Point. As they approached the vicinity, the son noticed a lifeless human body at the bottom of a cliff. It was lying among rocks about 200 meters north of Bluefish Point. Investigators quickly reached the area after they were notified of the discovery. The deceased male was found naked, lying at the base of the cliff. His clothes were found neatly folded at the top of the cliff with his shoes. A heavy metal pen was also left on top of the clothes pile. The body was identified as the 27-year-old mathematician and PhD, Scott Johnson. Despite the unusual circumstances, the death had been deemed a suicide in the initial investigation. On the morning of December 14, 1988, a forensic pathologist performed an autopsy on Scott. He concluded that Scott died as a result of multiple injuries that can be caused by either intentional or unintentional falling from the cliff. An amount of 0.005% alcohol was consistent with his blood. The pathologist also stated that in his 30 years of work, he never saw someone committing suicide by jumping from a cliff while naked, a statement that provides a different aspect to this case. Scott's family did not believe in the suicide theory from the beginning. Years of effort and petitions from Scott's family sparked coroner investigations in 2012 and 2015, which both recommended reopening the case. At the third inquest, new witnesses came forward to say the area was a known gay beat-up spot and told of gangs of men, including Australian Army soldiers, converging on the cliffs to commit gay hate assaults and robberies. According to some reports, Scott's death perfectly aligned with the several violent assaults on gay men that occurred in the late 80s in the adjacent areas. Many witnesses came forward with information about the NP3 gang and the Australian Army soldiers involved in gay bashings in Northern Beaches, North Sydney, and Sydney areas. The witnesses were so scared that they used pseudonyms because they feared if their identities were revealed, they would have to face the wrath of the infamous gang members. There was no direct evidence that connected Scott's death to these attacks, yet many still believed he fell prey to another one of those violent attacks. Then, in 2017, a coroner ruled that Johnson fell due to actual or threatened violence by unidentified persons who attacked him because they perceived him as homosexual. After that, a renewed police investigation was launched, and in 2018, a reward of $1 million Australian dollars for information that could help solve the crime was announced. That was then doubled to $2 million in 2020 when Scott's brother Steve put his own money on the table, hoping it would finally bring justice to his brother. It was estimated that up to 80 gay men were murdered by different homophobic gangs around Sydney in the late 1980s, with many pushed off cliffs. In the meantime, in 2019, an informant came forward after hearing about the case, which led investigators to 51-year-old Scott Philip White. The informant was White's ex-wife Helen, who told police that White had often bragged about bashing young gay men and had not denied killing Scott Johnson when she had asked. The family had, for years, fought for Australian police to investigate this as a gay hate crime. Finally, they had the person who had been hiding in plain sight for decades. A judge decided that there was insufficient evidence to establish it was a gay hate crime and sentenced White to jail for the 1988 killing. He will be eligible for parole in 2030. White, who was 18 at the time of the murder, did not give evidence in court, but had told police he and Scott had met at a bar in December 1988. It was also revealed that the pair had gone to North Head Cliffs in Manly, which was a well-known gay cruising ground. White claimed they got into a fight and Scott fell to his death, but a judge found that he had struck Scott without any provocation, knowing it would most likely cause the mathematician to fall to his death, which it did. Scott White was sentenced to a maximum of 12 years and 7 months in jail for the then 27-year-old's murder. After a long battle, Scott's family can finally sleep peacefully, knowing their brother got justice. Stephanie Lynn Hebert was born on June 30th, 1972. Her parents, Donald and Joyce Hebert, were longtime residents of a suburban neighborhood in Wiseman County, Louisiana. In May of 1978, 5-year-old sweet and cheerful Stephanie just graduated kindergarten at Live Oak Manor Elementary School. Shortly after that, schools were dismissed for the summer break, so it was the time for playdates, sleepovers, and fun in the sun for the children. And nobody had a clue that it would all change on June 13th, 1978. That morning, Stephanie came back to her house to grab a bite to eat after spending the previous night at her friend's house. After lunch, she was going to play with another friend. After spending some time with her mother, at around 2:30 p.m., little Stephanie left her home to go to her friend's house just 3 doors down. It never crossed Joyce's mind that this would be the last time she would see her daughter. Hours would go by before anybody realized that Stephanie never made it to her friend's house. Once they did, Stephanie's frantic parents called the Jefferson Parish Sheriff's Office to report that their daughter was missing. Authorities immediately began searching nearby areas for the little girl. About 100 deputies and 50 volunteers went down on foot through the dense woods and swampy areas with helicopters scanning over them. Stephanie's parents, volunteers from the community, conducted their own search. The FBI even joined the local police department to help with the search, but despite their relentless efforts, no traces of Stephanie would be found. The search took on an ominous tone when no traces of Stephanie was found after 72 hours of extensive searching. Although it was initially assumed that Stephanie had lost her way and was stuck somewhere, soon they were considering a possible abduction. 2 witnesses came forward after police started interviewing people in the community. An ice cream truck driver claimed that Stephanie came by to buy some cotton candy from her. She was accompanied by an unknown woman who wore heavy makeup and bright-colored shoes. The duo then walked toward a 1974 Pontiac Firebird Trans Am and drove away. An 8-year-old boy from the neighborhood also saw Stephanie with a woman of a similar description around 5:30 p.m., about 4 blocks from the Hebert home. Sadly, every effort to locate Stephanie was fruitless, as no car or woman of that description were ever found. After 5 months, just before Thanksgiving, a hunter found partial skeletal remains in a rural wooded area of St. Charles Parish, Louisiana, just about 20 miles away from Stephanie's home. A rope was wrapped around the little skeleton. It was evident that she was bound to a willow tree and left there, exposed to the harsh elements before her death. Stephanie's distinctive blue-rimmed glasses, shoes, and clothes were found nearby. Although the crime scene did not present many clues about the perpetrator, DNA was collected from the scene. The remains were identified as poor Stephanie Hebert after the autopsy was all done. Her parents were devastated at the gruesome discovery, as they always hoped that their daughter would be found alive. Detectives had only circumstantial evidence at the time, but they grew suspicious of a teenage neighbor, Roger Alexander. Stephanie was friends with Roger's sister and spent the previous night before her disappearance at their house to attend a sleepover. Detectives were confident that Roger was the killer and presented the case to a grand jury. However, Roger had an alibi that he was working with his cousin during Stephanie's disappearance and passed a polygraph test, so the jury declined to prosecute him due to insufficient evidence. But suspicions followed him for decades as the case remained cold. Then, years later, suspicion fell on another person, Daniel Parks, who lived near Stephanie's house when he was charged with the rape of a then 7-year-old girl. The victim testified that Parks had once threatened her, saying that she might end up like Hebert. When brought in for questioning, Parks confessed to the rape, as well as the comment about Stephanie, but later recanted his confession. He maintained that he had incorrectly implicated himself in the crime due to his condition of diabetes. He was found guilty of 2 counts of aggravated rape and was sentenced to life in prison, but could not be further connected with Stephanie's murder. In 2012, detectives got their big break in the case. 50-year-old Jason Franklin Jr., who went by Jay, came forward with secrets that he held on to for 3 decades. Jay described the sexual and physical abuse he suffered at his own father's hands, as well as his parents' involvement in Stephanie's abduction that ended with her death. Jay stated that Jason Franklin Sr., who was a resident of the area where Stephanie lived, raped the little girl on 3 separate occasions before the day of her murder. He also stated that while his father had been responsible for Stephanie's death, his mother was an accomplice. Joyce Vanette, Jay's mother, would often help Franklin Sr. fulfill his sick desires, despite the 2 of them being divorced. Jay revealed that it was Vanette who abducted Stephanie, using 6-year-old Jay as bait to lure the girl in. She then lured Stephanie into their car and drove her to a house in Luling, where Franklin Sr. was already waiting. At some point, he loaded Stephanie into a car and told his former wife to follow him with their 6-year-old son in tow. They drove to the swampy area where Stephanie's body would later be found. Jason took Polaroid photos of Stephanie after stripping her, while Jay was forced to pose with her. On previous occasions, Stephanie had kept her mouth shut about the abuse, but this time, she tearfully declared that she would tell her daddy everything. Jason then witnessed his father straddling Stephanie and binding her to a tree as he and his mother pulled away. Jay even led investigators to the exact area where Stephanie had been found. He said that he was so scared of his father that he had been unable to come forward until he was 50 years old. No arrest would follow along until 6 more years had passed after this testimony from Jay. While detectives slowly built their case against Jason, Vanette denied any involvement in Stephanie's murder and called her son a liar. Finally, in 2018, Jason Franklin Sr., 76, was arrested and taken into custody from his home in Massachusetts before being extradited back to Louisiana and charged with Stephanie's murder. He was also accused of raping 2 other children between 3 and 7 years old, along with Hebert. The other 2 incidents occurred between 1975 and 1977. Vanette would not be charged with Stephanie's abduction and murder due to a lack of evidence. The arrest brought a sense of peace to Stephanie's parents, Donald and Joyce, after decades of seeking justice for their daughter. They both passed away in 2020. As justice was on the way, the case came to an abrupt stop. In January 2022, Franklin Sr. died of a respiratory illness while in prison. In June 2022, detectives officially closed this 44-year-old cold case after the main witness, Jay, was killed by a drunk driver. Brittanee Drexel was born on October 7, 1991 in Rochester, New York. Shortly after Brittanee was born, Dawn married Chad Drexel, a military man who adopted the girl and loved her like his own daughter. After Chad's military service ended, the family lived in the Rochester suburb of Chile. Drexel was born with persistent hyperplastic primary vitreous in her right eye, which caused her vision to be hazy. This condition required several surgeries, and Brittanee ended up blind in that eye. To cover the eye's tendency to wander, she wore contact lenses that gave her a distinctive appearance. Brittanee was full of life. Despite her eye condition and small stature, she loved to play soccer. In her late teens, she developed a love of cosmetology and wanted to become a model. It was spring break in April 2009. 17-year-old Brittanee asked permission from her mother to go to Myrtle Beach, South Carolina with her boyfriend and some girlfriends. Her mother refused, as there were no accompanying adults on the trip, and she did not know the teenagers well. Call it mother's intuition or what you will, but she also had a hunch that something bad would happen on that trip. This led to arguments between the mother and daughter, which continued for several days. Finally, on April 22, 2009, her mother agreed when Brittanee asked if she could go to a friend's house for a day or two to calm down. However, Brittanee left for South Carolina with the other students without telling her mother. On April 25, 2009, Brittanee and the other teenagers arrived at the Bar Harbor Hotel in Myrtle Beach. Brittanee called her mother once during the daytime to tell her she was at the beach, but did not mention which one. Her mother assumed that Brittanee had been referring to a beach along the Lake Ontario shoreline, close to her friend's house where she was supposed to go. That night, around 8 p.m., Drexel left the hotel alone to visit a longtime friend who was staying at the Blue Water Resort. She was captured entering the Blue Water Resort on security cameras. She was wearing a black and white tank top, flip-flops and shorts, and was carrying a beige purse. Around 8:45 p.m., the cameras captured her leaving. Throughout the day, Brittanee was constantly texting back and forth with her boyfriend, John Greco, who had stayed in the Rochester area because of work commitments. Suddenly, around 9:15 p.m., her text stopped. After waiting for some time when Brittanee still did not respond, a worried Greco began calling her friends in Myrtle Beach to see if they knew where she was. When nobody had heard from her, Greco had no choice but to call Brittanee's mother to tell her the truth. Dawn was shocked to know that her daughter lied to her to go to Myrtle Beach. There was no time to hold a grudge though, as nobody could contact Brittanee. When repeated calls and texts to Brittanee's phone went unanswered, Dawn called Chad and then the Rochester police, hoping they could establish communications with their counterparts in South Carolina. The following morning, Myrtle Beach police began looking for Brittanee. They soon located the security footage from the Blue Water Resort and found the friend whom she had visited there. The last person to see Brittanee before she left was Peter Brozowitz, a 20-year-old nightclub promoter whom Brittanee had known from the Rochester area and was also vacationing in Myrtle Beach. Apparently, Brittanee had met up with him at a local nightclub the night before. Police interviewed him and the friend staying with him, but no person of interest was identified. The cell phone records showed that Brittanee's phone pinged 7 miles south of Myrtle Beach, just half an hour after her disappearance. Then, 2 hours after this, her cell phone pinged again. It was a town called McClellanville, 50 miles south of Myrtle Beach. The phone then went dead and the case went cold. No traces of Brittanee would be found after extensive searches. In 2016, 7 years after Brittanee's disappearance, this case would see a dramatic break. Taquan Brown, a South Carolina inmate serving a 25-year sentence for manslaughter, told investigators that he had witnessed what happened to Brittanee. He said that she was sexually assaulted, pistol whipped, and shot dead by a group of men, led by Timothy Deshaun Taylor, in the area where Brittanee's cell phone last pinged. Brown also said that they dumped Brittanee's body in a nearby swampy area full of alligators. However, Taylor denied all of these allegations.
I may as well start with the obvious question. Did you kill Brittanee Drexel?
No, sir. I did not kill Brittanee Drexel.
Were you involved in the kidnapping of Brittanee Drexel?
No, sir, I was not.
Were you with Brittanee Drexel the night she disappeared in April of 2009?
No, sir. I was not with her.
Had you ever met her, or what did you know about her?
I never met her personally or physically. The only thing I've known is from what I've been seeing on TV and the bulletins and what the FBI has been telling me so far. So that's the only thing that I personally know about her.
And that would have been after the fact?
Yes, sir. That would have been after April of 2009.
Once again, the case went silent due to insufficient evidence to charge anyone. In all those years, Brittanee's family had started to lose hope of ever finding her. But then, in May of 2022, Brittanee's case finally made a breakthrough. This came as a confession from a 62-year-old man named Raymond Moody. Raymond, a registered sex offender, turned himself in to the Georgetown County Sheriff's Office based on an obstruction of justice charge. He was a person of interest in Brittanee's disappearance in 2012, but it led nowhere. On May 4th, Moody confessed to the crime and provided a location of potential remains. On May 11th, human remains were located, which were buried in the woods off a private gated drive outside of Georgetown. After medical examination, those remains were identified as Brittanee Drexel's. It was discovered that she had been strangled and then buried on the morning of April 26, 2009. The most tragic part of all of this is that Raymond was released from prison in 2004 after serving 21 years of a 42-year sentence for abduction and rape. So if he had served his full sentence, Brittanee would still be alive today. While Brittanee's family is coping with their loss, Raymond Moody has been arrested and charged with Brittanee's murder. It is important to provide answers to the mourning families, as important as not letting these monsters roam around free. Our heart goes out to the families and friends who lost their loved ones. Let's hope to bring justice to everyone who hasn't gotten it yet. Let us know your thoughts on our list of 5 cold cases that were solved in 2022 in the comments section. Do not forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe for more captivating stories like this.